remember that day as vividly as if it had happened yesterday. Like a sudden lightning strike in the middle of a clear sky, my life was divided into before and after. My name is Leila, I'm 26, and up until that moment I had been living a very ordinary life. Work, meetings with friends, plans for the future with the man I loved, it all seemed so stable, so right. Steve was my boyfriend. Tall, confident, with the same smile that promised everything would be okay. We'd been together for almost 3 years. I imagined our future more than once, a cozy home, warm family evenings. It seemed that everything in my life was perfect. But perfect turned out to be an illusion. It was Sunday. I decided to surprise Steve by cooking his favorite meal, setting out candles to create a cozy evening. I imagined him coming into the apartment, seeing all this, and hugging me like only he knew how. But he didn't answer his phone. I figured he was probably late at work or had decided to meet some friends. Without giving it much thought, I went to his place. The door was slightly ajar, which already struck me as odd. Probably forgot to lock it, I thought, pushing it open. Inside, everything was quiet. Just that sound. Laughter. A woman's light, merry laugh, which echoed in my soul with anxiety. I walked into the living room and stopped, as if I'd run into an invisible wall. In front of me sat Steve and Monica, my best friend. They were together on the couch, his arms resting on her waist and her head resting on his shoulder. They were laughing, enjoying the moment, completely oblivious to my presence. In that instant, it was like the world stopped. My heart pounded so loudly that the whole house seemed to hear its rhythm. My legs felt woozy, and I felt the blood rush from my face. I stood frozen, unable to believe my eyes. But my eyes weren't deceiving me. It was real. I didn't scream. I didn't make a scene. It was like everything inside me froze, even my voice. I just turned around and walked out, not looking around as tears covered my eyes. The next few days passed like a blur. I avoided calls, I avoided people. Every corner of my apartment reminded me of how blind, gullible, naive I'd been. Steve tried to contact me, made excuses, but his words meant nothing anymore. The damage was done. I could no longer stay in this city where every place reminded me of betrayal. That's when I remembered my grandfather. Grandpa David had always been my rock, my silent beacon. After my grandmother died, he lived alone in the old family home on the outskirts of town. That place always felt like a refuge to me. He taught me to ride a bike, to grow flowers, to find joy in simple things. When I arrived at his house, he greeted me with his warm smile. "Leila," he said, hugging me, "you are always welcome here." Those words enveloped me like a soft blanket. I felt safe, for the first time in many days. But Grandpa himself carried a burden I didn't know I carried. At dinner, he talked about Grandma, about how she was the love of his life. About how her passing left a void that nothing could fill. I could see the pain in his eyes, a pain that reverberated through me. "We all lose something precious, Leila," he said one evening, looking out at the sunset. "The important thing is not to lose yourself." Those words were the key for me. A few weeks passed. Grandpa and I spent our days together, tending the garden, taking walks, sitting on the porch in silence. He taught me to see life anew, even through the pain. The rain outside the window was a monotonous wall, as if the entire universe had dissolved into that gray, viscous silence. I sat there, staring at the glass, watching as the drops coalesced into patterns before slowly dripping down. Inside me was as empty and cold as it was outside the window. Loneliness, heavy and endless, came over me in a wave, flooding my thoughts. I'd been thinking about Grandpa a lot these past weeks. Something had changed in him, though I couldn't say exactly what it was. His habits began to seem filled with new meaning. The way he would linger over old pictures of my grandmother, running his finger over them with trepidation, as if he were trying to feel her presence. Or the way he spoke to the plants in the garden quietly, gently, as if they were living things. It was a gentleness I hadn't noticed before. That day was especially hard. It kept raining, and I wandered around the house, lost in my thoughts. My feet led me to the door of my grandfather's studio. This place had always seemed out of reach, alien. As a child, I'd been told not to go in there. After my grandmother's death, it was as if the studio had been frozen in time. My hand reached for the doorknob, and I froze. The air around me seemed to grow thick and still. Soon I made up my mind and pushed open the door, which creaked open. The room was filled with the smell of old wood and paint. Grandpa sat in front of his easel, staring intently at the canvas. The brush froze in his hand. He didn't notice my presence. I stood on the doorstep, afraid to disturb him. There was a tense silence in the room, broken only by the light tapping of the rain against the glass. His figure seemed strong and fragile at the same time, as if he were part of the house, rooted in its walls. On the canvas was a portrait of my grandmother. Her eyes, painted with frightening accuracy, seemed to stare directly at me. That gaze made me hold my breath, something cold, alien in it. I cautiously took a few steps forward, feeling the air grow denser. Grandpa tilted his head slightly without turning, as if he sensed my presence. There was something vulnerable, touching in his posture that clutched my heart. I stopped next to him, looking at the painting. Grandma seemed so real, it was impossible to take my eyes off the canvas. The room was cold, but I could feel the warmth building in my chest. It was mixed with the anxiety that grew as I looked at every detail. The painting was almost finished, but something about it bothered me. It seemed like Grandpa was trying to portray something else besides Grandma. Something that couldn't be seen, but could be felt. Grandpa continued to sit still, as if he didn't want to ruin the moment. I gently touched his shoulder, and he flinched. The gesture seemed simple, but there was something more to it, as if I had touched not only him, but the longing he carried within him. My fingers lingered on his shoulder longer than I expected before I yanked my hand away. His gaze, when he finally turned to me, was deep, filled with something I couldn't understand. Longing, pain, and something that gave me goosebumps. Suddenly the studio felt uncomfortable. It felt as if the walls began to shrink, the air became heavy and the silence almost deafening. The painting on the easel seemed to come to life, my grandmother looking at me too intently. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Grandpa looked away slowly, focusing on the canvas again, but I thought I caught a faint smile, as if he knew something I couldn't understand. The feeling that someone was watching us became unbearable. I turned to the door, but it was closed. Only the rain outside the window continued its endless whispering, as if reminding me of something I'd rather not know. It was like a dream I couldn't afford to interrupt. The moments stretched like an eternity as I felt the warmth of his hand on my cheek. The touch was so gentle, as if he was afraid I would disappear like a shadow into the midday light. His eyes searched mine for answers, and I couldn't find the words to explain the storm inside me. I wanted to tell him how his presence, quiet and unobtrusive, was the only support in those moments when life was falling apart. I wanted to confess how every morning when I woke up knowing he was somewhere near was a lifesaver for me. But the words stuck like a knot in my throat, preventing them from coming out. Instead, I felt tears start to roll down my cheeks, one by one. He saw them. His gaze softened, and there was something new in it, deep, sincere, as if he couldn't believe these emotions were taking over him. And then, without thinking, I did something I hadn't expected myself to do. I leaned forward and touched my lips to his cheek. It was a light, almost weightless touch, but it echoed in every corner of my being. I wanted to pull away, afraid of my boldness, but something changed. His breathing became ragged, and he slowly lifted his hand to touch my cheek. His fingers, rough but surprisingly gentle, slid over my skin. He looked at me as if he had the whole universe in front of him, and I was the center of it. "You don't have to do this," his voice was barely audible, almost a whisper, but every word echoed in my heart. "I don't want you to feel uncomfortable." He fell silent, and in the pause between words, I could feel us both drowning in this moment. "But I can't help it," he finally whispered, and his confession pierced me. I didn't know how to respond. Everything felt wrong, but at the same time, absolutely right. His closeness was too scalding, his scent a mixture of wood and paint filled my lungs, and I couldn't breathe. "I feel it, too," I finally said, and my voice shook, as if I was afraid to break the fragility of this moment. His gaze changed. There was determination mixed with trepidation. His hand stayed on my cheek, and with the other he reached closer to look into my eyes once more. His breath was so close, I could feel his warmth on my lips. We froze in that space, oblivious to everything around us. I could feel my heart beating faster with each passing moment as the distance between us shrank. He was so close I felt like I could hear his heartbeat. His lips leaned toward mine, but stopped a few inches away as if he was waiting for my permission. "Are you sure?" he whispered, and I felt his shiver run through my body. I couldn't answer with words, so I just nodded, closing my eyes. A moment later, our lips met, and the world ceased to exist. That kiss was filled with everything we'd been holding back for years: pain, hope, fear, and love. When we pulled away, I looked up at him, feeling a warmth grow in my chest. His gaze spoke more than any words could. I didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid. There was something inexplicable in his eyes, a mixture of guilt, desire, and struggle with himself. He was looking at me as if he were seeing me for the first time, as if he were trying to find answers where I didn't know them. His hands were still on my neck, his fingers lightly touching my skin, as if afraid to scare away the fragile moment. I could feel the heat from his body, hear the quiet rhythm of his breathing. It was all too real, too vivid to be a mistake. He fell silent, as if he didn't dare finish the sentence, afraid that reality would ruin the moment. His thumb ran lightly over my lips, like he was trying to make sure I was really here. My heart pounded so hard it seemed he could hear it. I don't know," I whispered, struggling to get the words out. Chaos raged inside me. It was impossible to ignore the attraction, the pull that made me press closer to him. He stared at me, trying to read my emotions. All I could feel was reality coming apart at the seams, leaving us alone in the world. His lips touched mine again, this time with an insistence that made me dizzy. It was a kiss full of hunger, but not rough. His fingers, firm but gentle, slid down my neck, stopping at my shoulders, as if he was afraid to let me go, afraid to lose me. I responded as if the world outside this room had ceased to exist. When we finally pulled away, our faces were only a few inches apart. His gaze burned through me, leaving a rippling wave of heat in my chest. I knew it couldn't be right, but in that moment, I didn't care. "You deserve better." "What if that's exactly what I want?" I interrupted, surprised at my own audacity. His face softened, but there was still a struggle in it. He pulled me closer, carefully, as if I were a fragile porcelain doll. "Do you realize that nothing will ever be the same after this?" he whispered, his breath touching my cheek. "I don't know what will happen," I answered honestly. "But I do know one thing. I want to be here now. With you." The words sounded like a confession, like a challenge. I felt him freeze, pondering them, and then he took a step toward me. His fingers rested on my waist, sliding upward, stopping just below my collarbone. The gesture was so vulnerable that goosebumps ran down my skin. We froze in that moment, as if time had stopped. His palm rested on my cheek, and I closed my eyes, surrendering to the warmth of his touch. "You're mine," he breathed out so softly that I barely caught the words. Even though I knew that these moments would not be without consequence, that a whole new life awaited us, the only thing that mattered to me now was his hands, his voice, his breath beside me. Nothing else mattered. Not the past, not the future. Only the present, full of heat and contradictions that were simultaneously tearing me apart and pulling me together.